All right, everyone, buckle up. We're about to take a deep dive into some fascinating territory today. British values, but not just any old way.
No, not at all.
We've got this blog post by Tony Parkin. It's called My British Values via Cherry Street and Cherry Blossom Parkin Space. Catchy, right?
Definitely grabs your attention.
It's all about his experience in a British primary school back in the 1950s and how those years really shaped how he sees, well, Britishness.
It's amazing how these early experiences, even the ones we don't think much about at the time, can have such a lasting impact.
Exactly. And what I found so interesting about Parkin's writing is how honest he is. He's not afraid to look back critically at his own upbringing and point out the flaws.
Right, he's using his personal story as a jumping off point to talk about these bigger questions of
Mhm.
education, national identity, even a little bit of how we tell history.
Absolutely. So he starts by painting this picture of his early years at Cherry Street School in York, talks about these really kind teachers, the kind you never forget.
The ones that leave a mark.
Exactly. But he also mentions how British values weren't really a big topic of conversation back then. It wasn't like they were explicitly taught.
It's interesting, isn't it? Like they were just absorbed from the environment, the atmosphere of the school.
Yeah, kind of like osmosis or something.
Exactly. And that actually ties into the educational approaches of that era, more about observation, modeling good behavior.
Subtle, rather than hammering it in.
Exactly.
Now, he does mention this one teacher, Miss Boosfield, who sounds like she was a real force,
Yeah.
lost her fiancé in World War I and dedicated her life to teaching. Yeah, it makes you think about the weight of those experiences, especially since there's not much in the blog about how the war itself actually impacted what they learned in school.
Interesting point. Almost like there's this focus on normalcy, on tradition, brushing past the upheaval of such a massive global event.
Trying to rebuild a sense of stability, perhaps?
Could be. But even within that framework of tradition,
Yeah.
there were these fascinating elements of how history was presented to them.
Oh, absolutely. He talks about this history reader they used, filled with tales of British heroes, figures like King Alfred, Boadicea.
The great men and women approach to history.
Exactly. Looking back, it makes you wonder how those narratives were constructed. Like, were they really learning about these historical figures, or were they being fed a very specific version of Britishness?
Right. Were they learning about these figures' actual accomplishments or just how those accomplishments fit into a broader narrative of, say, British exceptionalism?
And here's a little detail I found fascinating. Parkin points out that Boadicea was always portrayed as being impeccably and decently dressed in the book's illustrations.
Really?
Yeah, which is so different from how she's often depicted today, the warrior queen leading the charge.
It just goes to show how these historical narratives are constantly being reframed and reinterpreted. But it also makes you think, what message were those illustrations sending to young minds? What values were they subtly reinforcing?
It's like they were being prepped to see the world through a very particular lens, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And this wasn't just limited to history lessons either. Parkin then goes on to describe these elaborate Empire Day celebrations at the school.
Ah, Empire Day, a relic of a bygone era.
Right. He talks about this massive map on the classroom wall, practically covered in pink to represent the British Empire in all its glory.
Wow. Talk about a visual representation of how they saw the world.
It's pretty striking imagery, right? And it speaks to a time when the legacy of colonialism was just accepted.
Definitely. It was a different world.
And get this, it wasn't just about the map.
Oh, I'm sure there's more.
He talks about these huge school pageants they'd have for Empire Day, with kids marching around waving flags from every corner of the empire.
You know, it's interesting how he talks about those celebrations almost like they were carefree, but then also mentions becoming aware of, the complexities of the British Empire.
Yeah.
He even mentions Gandhi and India's fight for independence.
Wow, it's like they were living through this pivotal moment in history, but maybe not fully understanding the significance at the time.
Exactly. And then he talks about how in his last year, Empire Day became Commonwealth Day. New headmaster came in, no more marching, and he figures that big map probably came down off the wall too.
It's a small change, but
Symbolic of a much larger shift, right?
yeah,
Like how language and even rituals can reflect these big social and political changes happening beneath the surface.
definitely. But one of the things that really struck me about Parkin's blog post was how he wrestles with this idea of national pride and Well, something a little more complicated than that.
Yeah, the undercurrents of it all.
Right. He talks about how his education, while it emphasized all these positive values, also kind of instilled this sense of smug superiority that he's spent years trying to unlearn.
That's a powerful statement.
It is, and he even uses the word brainwashing at one point.
Wow. That's pretty strong language.
It is. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it speaks to how strongly he feels about this and his willingness to really confront some uncomfortable truths about his own upbringing. It's not just about memorizing dates and kings and queens. It's about how those things shape a whole worldview.
And he talks about actually feeling uncomfortable looking back at those illustrations from his childhood history book, the ones with British heroes, you know, always vanquishing their enemies.
It's like those images often presented as just straightforward history. They carry these implicit biases, right? It's not just about what happened in the past, but how we choose to remember it, how we frame it.
Exactly. And then it makes you wonder about the lasting impact of those stories, especially if a whole generation is raised with this idea of their nation's inherent superiority. How does that affect how they see the world, how they interact with other cultures?
That's the real question, isn't it? And I don't think it's saying we should shy away from teaching about national identity or even celebrating one's heritage. It's about doing it thoughtfully, with an awareness of the potential pitfalls.
He even quotes a former Archbishop of Canterbury who warned that patriotism easily becomes the god of power.
That's a powerful quote.
It is, and Parkin goes on to say, it's only a small step from national pride to nationalism, and from there to the misnamed National Socialism.
It's a chilling thought, a reminder that even pride in one's nation can be twisted into something really dangerous.
Absolutely. But then the question becomes, how do we navigate that? How do we cultivate a sense of belonging and national identity without veering into, those murky waters?
It's a tough one. And I think Parkin is advocating for a more nuanced approach, one that emphasizes those human values we share instead of these narrow definitions of national identity.
So more about finding common ground than emphasizing differences.
Exactly. He talks about the need for empathy, for truly understanding and recognizing our shared humanity, even across cultures. It's about acknowledging how complex history is and engaging in those sometimes difficult conversations.
Not shying away from the tough stuff just because it might make us uncomfortable.
Exactly. Real patriotism, if that's even the right word, shouldn't be afraid of a little discomfort. It's about being honest about both the triumphs and the mistakes, and then learning from them.
Being willing to have those difficult conversations and maybe even learn something new about ourselves along the way, which seems like a perfect place to take a quick break. And we're back. Picking up our deep dive with Tony Parkin and his reflections on British values in a world that's constantly changing.
It's certainly given us a lot to think about.
It really has. That phrase Parkin uses, that smug superiority, it's stuck with me.
It's powerful, isn't it?
It is, because it's like this subtle thing, this undercurrent that can shape how we see ourselves and other people without us even realizing it.
Absolutely. And he talks about how he even catches himself feeling it sometimes, like when he looks back at those illustrations from his old history book, the ones with the British heroes always coming out on top.
Right, always vanquishing their enemies.
Exactly. And it highlights how those narratives, even when they're presented as objective history, can carry these hidden biases, these assumptions about who's right and who's wrong, who's strong and who's weak.
And to be clear, he's not saying we should erase history or feel ashamed of where we come from. It's more about, acknowledging the complexities, the nuances.
Yes, understanding that history is rarely black and white. There are contradictions, different perspectives, uncomfortable truths that we have to grapple with.
And maybe that discomfort is actually a good thing. It makes us question our assumptions, be open to different ways of seeing things.
Exactly. Parkin even talks about how his own understanding of those British values has changed over time. What he once saw as, straightforward virtues, he now recognizes as being bound up with these more problematic aspects of history, like colonialism.
It makes you wonder how much of what we believe is shaped by those early experiences, the stories we're told growing up.
It's a lot to unpack, isn't it?
It really is. But that's what I appreciate about Parkin's writing, He's
Right.
not giving us easy answers, just inviting us to think critically about these things.
To question those narratives we've inherited and embrace a more, shall we say, complex understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
And honestly, I think that's so important, especially today with everything going on in the world.
Right, with rising nationalism, political polarization, all these divisions.
Exactly. It feels more important than ever to be mindful of the stories we tell ourselves and each other, the narratives we embrace and promote.
It's about recognizing that our identities, both as individuals and as nations, are complicated and they're always evolving. What might have been considered okay, even celebrated, in the past, might not hold up to scrutiny today.
And that's okay. It's about being open to that evolution, to learning and growing, and yeah, maybe even being a little uncomfortable along the way. As we wrap up this deep dive, I think the big takeaway for me is that it's not enough to simply inherit values, no matter how positive they might seem. We have a responsibility to examine them, understand where they come from, and make sure they line up with the kind of world we want to live in.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And if I could just add one final thought, it's this. Let's approach these conversations with empathy, curiosity, and a genuine willingness to listen to and learn from each other. Because ultimately, it's through dialogue and understanding that we can bridge those divides and build a better future.
I love that. Well said. And on that note, a huge thank you to everyone for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and embracing the complexity of our world.